All right, guys, listen, our first guest tonight, our only guest tonight, will be the WWE legend. You know him as Paul Bearer. You also might know him as Percy Pringle, but tonight he is our friend and our guest. How you doing tonight, buddy?
I'm doing wonderful. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
Oh, listen, we appreciate the time. We really, really do. But you know what? Listen, just talking about your names, that's a perfect place to start. Everybody knows you. Most people know you as Paul Bearer. You're the guy with The Undertaker. But a lot of people in the indie scene, a lot of people who followed the wrestling business for a long time, we know you as Percy Pringle. We know you before the time in the WWE. Why don't you tell the fans a little bit, the fans that might not know who you are, where you come from, like where you started in the wrestling business and how you worked your way through it to where you are now?
Well, first of all, let me plug my website, which will make it really, really easy for the fans. My website is www.percypringle.com. And anything you want to know about me from the time I started until this very day is on there. So if you want to do a little bit more research or you want to see some old pictures about some things that we're talking about, you can check my website out. But anyway, long story short, I'm a little redneck born in Mobile, Alabama, born on the beautiful Gulf Coast of Alabama on the Gulf of Mexico. And I grew up in the old school wrestling, of course. I grew up in back in the territory days. It was called Gulf Coast Wrestling. That was the wrestling that I got to see. Of course, back in those days, we didn't have cable TV or anything like that. All we had was the aftermags, and and if you weren't a hardcore fan, you didn't even know about those. But the people the fans that watch wrestling in my hometown, not just my hometown, in any hometown across the country, they didn't know what was going on in other parts of the country, or even realize that wrestling may even existed in other parts of the country. But I was one of the hardcore fans back then, and I pretty much had my finger on the pulse of the business, and I knew what was going on, and I knew that one day I was going to be in the wrestling business. And so I went to the matches every week. I think one time I counted, I think I went for 7 years straight, sitting on the front row, never missed a night. Here on the Gulf Coast, and I was just hooked back then, and very, 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 very similar to Jim Cornette. I started taking pictures, and started taking pictures for the office after a period of time, and they used my pictures and their programs that they would sell and their publicity in the newspaper and this, that, and the other. So that's pretty much how I got my foot in the door and started meeting the wrestlers, and I knew that's what I wanted to do. And this is when I was about a senior in high school, and I graduated high school in 1972. So that makes me pretty old. I'm 58 years old, and I'm proud of it. But anyway, long story short, I started out as a wrestler, believe it or not. I had my first match in 1974. And so I had a career way before Paul Bearer was ever even thought about. As a matter of fact, a lot of people don't know that I am a legit mortician. I'm a licensed funeral director and embalmer. So there was a period of time there where I would combine the two, and I would wear a mask and call myself the embalmer and take a casket out to the ring and do a lot of the things that we did once, the Paul Bearer Undertaker character came about in 1990 and 1991. So I was doing that stuff back in those days. So it was pretty easy for me to transition and come up with ideas for the Paul Bearer Undertaker stuff that we were doing, early on when that gimmick first started, when I first started working for Vince. But I worked in several territories down around the South and got my first big break in 1978. In fact, Michael Hayes, Freebird, which I would know him as the Freebird, Michael Hayes. He was from Pensacola, Florida, and I was from Mobile, Alabama, and we're only like 45 minutes away, so we grew up on the same wrestling. And not only him, Rock and Roll Express, Robert Gibson. His brother was already in the business at the time, Ricky Gibson. He was already wrestling. But it was me and Michael Hayes and Robert Gibson and a guy that some of you guys might have heard of, John Tatum, Hollywood John Tatum, who wrestled out in world-class wrestling back in those days, and also for Bill Watts, him and Missy Hyatt. Missy Hyatt was his valet back in those days. But there was a handful of us that wanted to be wrestlers, and we'd set the ring up, take the ring down, and do whatever we could, just to get our foot in the door. Like I said, my end was being a photographer. So me and Michael Hayes and all of us, we grew up, with the dream of wanting to get into the wrestling business. And I was the real freak because I wanted to be a mortician as well as a wrestler. And who in the hell would ever thought that you could combine those two?
Hey, you were
down
born
the
for
road,
Undertaker. You were born for the Paul Bearer gimmick.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, there's a lot of years from 1978 until I actually, became Paul Bearer. I spent 6 years. I spent from 85 to 90, let's see. I signed my first contract with Vince in December. In fact, on December 22nd, 1990, I signed my first contract with Vince McMahon, and we're just a few days from that anniversary, and which would be December 22nd. And I started on the road with The Undertaker in January of 91. Of course, The Undertaker started at Survivor Series 1990. So it seemed, I know it does to me, a lot of the fans that were watching back then, it seemed like it was a long time that Brother Love was with Undertaker, but actually he wasn't. He wasn't with him that long because, like I said, Taker started in Survivor Series in November 90, and I started on the road with him in January of 91. So Brother Love wasn't with him, but just a few months. And what was so ironic about that whole story, and you'll read about this in more detail on my website, is that World Class was closing down. Jerry Jarrett had came in there at the end and took over. That's after the Von Erichs had already walked away. But I had spent 6 years with World Class, with the Von Erich family, and which I loved each and every one of them dearly. And the Sportatorium, I just loved that building. What an ambiance it was for wrestling, and all your hardcore fans can remember watching World Class Wrestling on ESPN and the various outlets that it was on back in those days. Because those certainly were some fantastic days, although there were some very, very sad days because one by one, we were losing the Von Erichs. Not only the Von Erichs, Gino Hernandez and several others passed away during those times. But I was there for 6 years straight. I had an office in the Sportatorium, and an old-timer told me years before if I was going to be a manager that I should always be doing something else, with the wrestling company that I was working for, so I would always have employment. So not only was I Percy Pringle, the manager, which I went in there with, this can be very confusing. I went in there in 1985 with Rick Rude. Me and Rick Rude met and were put together as a team down in Florida, Championship Wrestling from Florida. This is when Eddie Graham was still alive. In fact, we were there when Eddie Graham passed away. So we had a chance to work the old Florida territory with Gordon Soley and all the other guys back in those days, and what a solid foundation that I had, as I progressed through the business and through the 6 years in Dallas. And then when Dallas closed down, I worked for Jerry Jarrett for several months, and then I decided that it was time to move home, and told my wife, and we talked about it. We just had a brand new baby, a brand new son. I have two sons. In fact, that brand new son then, he's 25 now.
Oh, man.
So that was a long time ago. But anyway, we had talked about it and decided that maybe it was time to move back home to good old Mobile, Alabama, and I was going to go back into the funeral business. And it was a coincidence that Rick Rude had called me that day, and I told him what my decision was, and he says, no, definitely no. You just hang on. Don't do nothing. Don't make any decisions until I call you back. He says, give me a couple of days, I'll call you back. That very afternoon, he called me back. He says, you got a pencil? I said, yeah. He said, write this number down, which I did. I said, okay. I said, whose number is this? He says, this is Vince McMahon's home number. He wants to talk to you. So I was kind of apprehensive about calling Vince McMahon for the first time, although he knew who I was because, of course, Vince, was very familiar with all the talent all over the country. He saw the world-class stuff, and he knew who Percy Pringle was. And, of course, I knew who Vince McMahon was. And anybody that was in the business and wanted to stay in the business and wanted to make some money in the business wanted to go to work for the then WWF, at that time. Well, anyway, long story short, it was Christmas time, and he brought me up, and we had an interview. And what was so funny about the whole situation was, and if we only had a tape of this moment, is when Vince McMahon realized that I was a real mortician, that I was a licensed funeral director, and that I realized that he was looking for a manager for The Undertaker. I mean, it was just meant to be. And myself and The Undertaker had a history prior to that. I managed The Undertaker in his very first match in the business at the Sportatorium in Dallas against Bruiser Brody. Bruiser Brody was booking at that time in Dallas, and The Undertaker, Mark Calloway, was hanging out the back door wanting to be a wrestler, just like we all did, just like I did, 15 years before that. So one night, Bruiser Brody decided to give him a break and handed him a mask and said, here, put this mask on. We're going to call you Texas Red, and I'll work with you. And if you go on YouTube right now and type in there Texas Red and Bruiser Brody, or Bruiser Brody and Texas Red, you will see The Undertaker's very first match in the business, wrestling Bruiser Brody with me as his manager. And needless to say, Bruiser Brody beat The Undertaker's butt all over that building. In fact, The Undertaker will tell you to this very day, after all these years, that the only reason that they sent me out there with him was to show him the way back to the dressing room, because he had a few of those old wooden chairs broken over him, and that was the history there. So me and The Undertaker had a history prior to the Undertaker Paul Bearer get together there in January of 1991, which the chemistry was just natural, and the history after that is just chiseled in stone.
We actually just discovered the video. Undertaker was wearing a mask during this match, correct?
Correct. He was called Texas.
Yeah, we have it right here. This is great footage. You're wearing an awful yellow jacket, though. That was just a sign of the times, I'd assume, right?
that was my gimmick then. I wore suit jackets that had different colors, several different kinds, several different colors, but they had stars on them. I had yellow and black and white and black and all different kinds of colors. But that footage is The Undertaker's very first match in professional wrestling. Well, I'll take that back. I'll have to say it was his very first paid television match in pro wrestling, and I was his manager. And how ironic was that? And here we are in 2000. In 2002, here we are in 2012, almost 2013, and we still are very, very dear friends and still have a great relationship after all those years. It was just meant to be.
Yeah, everything happens for a reason. Mike Chiara, you have a question?